Surrey, the Surrey Writers Conference, and I'm really delighted I made it here because I double booked, and I wasn't sure I'd make it, but I'm glad.
I wasn't sure you would either, actually. We were a little bit nervous, but I'm so glad. So, and you found good parking.
Yes, I did.
That's almost a miracle. Okay, this is meant to be.
Yes. So thank you very much for the hospitality. It's always a real pleasure to be here.
Fantastic.
So I guess you wanted me to talk about just kind of where the book comes from. So I know some of you have read the book and some haven't. But is there a particular question you'd like me to attend to?
I mean, I think for those of you who haven't had the chance to read the book, I think that what is really strikes me, and I think is that audiences are responding to, are the chapter titles, which are "How do we learn to be human? How do we behave as a good relative? How do we become good ancestors? How do we learn to live together?" And then reading the ruptures, keeping a fire. And I think, I remember when this book was had in fact at that famous conference where we had our textbooks ripped apart in 2014, you gave the keynote speech. And it was really a foundational talk. Remember, it was like the Thursday night keynote, in fact, that had a lot of kind of the kernel of this idea. And I just wonder, I think it would be helpful to readers to just know what you were thinking, what kind of helped you, drove you to think with these particular titles and your work.
So when I was a prof at the University of Toronto, one of my students she's an emerging writer, Christine Duquay Smith, is an emerging writer, and she started a website and a blog. And she wanted me to write for her blog. And she asked me to write about why Aboriginal literatures matter. Or maybe it was Indigenous, I don't remember. And I was really taken by that question because I'd been teaching Indigenous Lit for years, and I've been a fan and been researching and studying it, and I'd never asked that question. Like, that's a pretty elemental, basic question. And so I wrote a response, and I think I had like 7 reasons. And they were very like, here's why they matter, here's why they matter, here's why they matter. And it was fine. I was convinced by my argument. I thought I was right? But as I've gotten older as a scholar, I've gotten less certain of my rightness about things. And I think I was less interested in coming up with answers than I was in offering questions for people to explore why. I mean, I know why Indigenous literatures matter to me, but it's not going to be the same reason they matter to you. There'll be some overlap, but there'll be some real distinctions too. So and as I was doing work, and this really came from working with folks in Aboriginal Studies at University of Toronto, I had a lot of really good teachings from my colleagues. And I was a learner. And one of the things I was becoming more and more aware of is that there are a lot of things that are very different between our nations. And I'm always really hesitant to go to the universalist, like there's one thing that we all share. But I think those 4 questions are questions that really engage a lot of our fundamental cultural, spiritual, philosophical, intellectual, familial values. And those questions just kept coming, and so that's when I was teaching Indigenous worldview and oral traditions at Toronto. Those were the questions that grounded my courses. And they're very open-ended, right? And they're very, very responsive to community specificities. But I don't trust directive answers. I trust questions that are given, because if you think about so many times we're given teachings, they're not, you must do this. This is the answer. It's, well, let me tell you a story. And then you figure it out. And there's accountability, there's responsibility and care that comes with that, and there's a relationship that builds. And so when I was thinking about writing the book, that ended up being how I framed it. But the funny, and Deanna will know this because she's the editor of the series, and I was very late with this book. Like 2 years late with this book.
Every way.
I am not dependable with deadlines, so I'll just say that. I've tried to fight that, and now I think I really just have to accept that. But I realized part of it was, that's a pretty heady title to try to do justice to, right? Why do Indigenous Literatures Matter? Well, I'll give you the book on it. I mean, that, after I got the contract, I was like, what the hell did I do? But it was when I started framing it with those questions that I actually found a way into it. And so that's where it came. And this is a weird little book. The texts are not what a lot of people would expect necessarily. There are some canonical writers and a lot of non-canonical writers. They're writers that I like. And I wanted to write a book about people I like. Not all writers I like on here. Sherman Alexie, I think, is a prick, but I think he's written some stuff that I think we have to take seriously and attend to, and that we also have to take his behavior seriously and attend to that as well. And there are people who do some really great stuff and not great stuff, but I thought all of these texts spoke in thoughtful and compelling ways to the themes. But anybody could take those 4 themes and write a totally different book. And that was kind of what I wanted, was that these questions would help frame people's thoughts. And and I've actually been hearing that from people who've been teaching the book, that's one of the exercises that they give their students is one of the questions. And the responses are so amazing. And they're so different. And that's what it's about.
One of the things that I really noticed when you moved from U of T to UBC, and Vancouver's Indigenous literary scene was got a real boost, is that you came from the American system. I've already talked to the students before about how Indigenous literary studies in Canada is really very new. But in America, you as an undergraduate student, you were reading Indigenous texts, and as a master's student and as a PhD student, and you've been teaching them, and you come from, which is very evident in this book. It's like we're seeing a table that's being set every day by new authors, and you come from an incredibly rich reading background that I think is such a gift to us as readers. And I just wonder if you ever think about even questions about how this book maybe links to what I think is the movement that kind of helped kick off this is what we now call Indigenous literary nationalism. Or, do you see this as an extension to Indigenous literary nationalism? Do you feel like you identify as a nationalist? Or do you feel like it's taking us someplace beyond that?
I think the nationalist conversation is still part of the discussion. It's still very rooted in Cherokee specificity. I still think that the specific matters. I think our national traditions matter. But I'm also, I think that certainty when I was younger and more identified as a literary nationalist, I think I was much more a fiery nationalist. But part of that was because it was coming out of insecurity, because I wasn't raised in community. And that was a way to be kind of formidably Cherokee, right, or to be a nationalist. But I mean, the reality is there are great things about literary nationalism, but there are also huge blind spots in the mode. And I still consider myself a literary nationalist, but I hope I'm a more nuanced nationalist in that way. And I think part of it is getting older and being more comfortable with the ambivalence. But I think those questions still matter a lot. But also the argument's kind of over because we won.
I know.
I mean, to be honest, I'm still a little fussy that way, right? But not that we won and kind of decimated our option. But I think nationalists were never saying that ours were the only voices that mattered. We were caricatured as saying that. And I think some of the cosmopolitanist critics saw literary nationalism through a different lens than we understood it through. And I think ultimately the reason, I was being kind of flippant in terms of we won, but I think there was a better understanding that we were not talking about exclusivist nationalisms, but we were talking, and we weren't saying that non-Indigenous people had no place in the field.
Yeah.
We were transparently not saying that.
Yeah.
But what we were saying was that Indigenous literatures should have Indigenous centrality. And then we can go elsewhere, but we need to be rooted in where we are and who we are. And then we can bring in other kinds of conversations, but it was never that we were the only conversation that mattered. It was, let's start here, let's ground it in a place that has very, very deep roots, and then branch out, rather than imagine that the branches are all that matter.
And just, I know, I'm just mindful that there are some undergrads in the classroom, and just to give you a little bit of a sense of what the impact that this has, is well, we credit Jeanette Armstrong in 1992, but also in America, Creek scholar Craig Womack, who wrote a book called Red on Red. In other words, as a Creek person, he takes Creek stories to understand Creek stories. And so, I have Squamish worldviews help you understand Squamish stories. And what it does is instead of maybe venturing over to a toolbox that's filled with tools created, for the typical literary canon, or even for the post-colonial canon, you're instead paying attention to the specific nations connected to the books. And so it was revolutionary. And I think your book, which I'd be really great if you just meant the name right now, it's got fire in it.
Oh, Our Fire Survives the Storm.
Our Fire Survives the Storm is a Cherokee view of Cherokee stories, which has been was foundational to the field. And so the fact that this follows up on that is I'm just really, I think will intrigue any of you who are interested in those kinds of questions.
Well, but so what I love about literary nationalism for me, especially when I was reconnecting, was it helped me understand my work as a literary scholar in a lineage. But it wasn't only that lineage, and Cherokees are complicated people too. And I sent, so it was a dissertation before it was the book, and I sent the dissertation to the nation. We don't have a review board, but we had a really lovely and very tough policy analyst in the nation who took it, so our chief, Chad Smith, gave it to Richard, and Richard got together a couple of other folks, the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, and I don't remember who the third one was, and they read it, and I was terrified. I wasn't raised in Oklahoma, so I'm a citizen, but is this going to... And I got really, really good feedback. I got some painful feedback as well, but it was really important feedback. But Richard still doesn't like the dualism that I identified, because he says, well, that's pretty literary, but I don't know that that's cultural. I'm like, Richard! And he's a lovely man, very, very kind. But, and one point he made was, Daniel, there's a difference between being a Cherokee citizen and a Cherokee Indian. And he was making it very clear that I was a Cherokee citizen, but not a Cherokee Indian, because for him, to be a Cherokee Indian, you're raised in community. You have the language. It doesn't matter what your blood quantum is. It doesn't matter what your phenotype is. It's how were you raised? Were you raised knowing what it is to be Cherokee culturally? And he wasn't denying that I was a relative, but I was a particular kind of relative. And those were painful conversations, but they were really important conversations. And I think all of that, I think it was necessary to be humbled. And it was like he wasn't embarrassing it. He wasn't doing it to be unkind, but it was usefully corrective. And I hope that what I learned out of that has informed this work. If I were to write Our Fire Survives the Storm again today, it would be a totally different book. There's a lot of things that would be similar. But another thing with that is there's a book that just came out from another Cherokee literary scholar, Kirby Brown, called Stoking the Fire, and it's about nationhood in Cherokee literature in the early 20th century. And that book wouldn't exist without mine. And he's been very, not that I'm not making that claim, but those are things he said. But when I look at his book, I'm like, damn, I wish I would have written that one. Because it's so smart and it's more grounded, right? So you're part of a lineage, and it's just amazing to see people who because I was on his committee and I was part of the process there. And they go so much farther than you ever imagined. And now you can go farther because they've done that imagining, right? So you're learning from the people who learn from you, and it's just extraordinary. It's an extraordinary experience to be at this place in my career and to actually kind of be, I'm not quite an elder, but to be to be a senior scholar in the field, and to watch how these conversations are going, and so much, we're able to have such different conversations than we were when I started.
That's really fantastic. On one hand, I want to ask you about your fantasy writing because some of you have read Tatterborn. On the other, I want to think about Warren Carreyrou. Recently, I was able to hear him speak about something called critical humility, that he, as a value, and just hearing the resonances from what he was saying to what you're saying now. And then on my third impulse is to think, look at a room full of people. Maybe I should give them a chance to ask a question before we just spend a little bit of time visiting. So I just wonder if there's a call out for any questions you have for Jenny. Yes.
I hope this isn't too unrelated, but you called Sherman Alexei a prick, and I just
that was going to come and bite me, I knew. So Alexei this year, I think, earlier this year, was revealed to have engaged in extensive sexual harassment and other unpleasant and abusive behaviors. Now the reality is that was a surprise to me, but it wasn't really a surprise. He's been a pretty ungenerous person for many years, and I have seen and heard of really shocking behavior, just boorish behavior, very discourteous behavior in public, and with a wide range of people, including a friend of mine in the nation who, when he went to